The ideas expressed in the following presentations are those of the speakers and do not necessarily reflect the views of ACI or its committees. ACI web sessions are recorded at ACI conventions or other concrete industry events and will be made available for viewing free of charge for 1 week. Thereafter, they will be archived on the ACI website or added to ACI's online CEU program, depending on their content.
I hope to give you a little bit of my perspective as a building official on 562, and before I even get started, I just want to really commend the entire committee of 562 for how hard they work to address lots of different concerns besides just the practitioner using the code, but also contractors, suppliers, you name it. This was something that was a really well thought out document, and I really think everybody who worked on this needs to be very proud of it. Just a little bit on why are existing buildings important. In a jurisdiction like mine in New York City, we have many more existing buildings than we have new construction going on. As much new construction as we have a lot more existing buildings. Almost 1 million buildings in New York City that are existing. For some reason, somebody stopped counting at 975,000. I'm not sure why, but that's where they gave up. But we've had more since, and all of them are built under various earlier codes, dating back to 1899. The Empire State Building, I think, was built under a version of the 1916 codes with, local amendments through the 1920s. I showed here the Woolworth Building, which was also built under the 1916 code, and right next to it another high-rise that was built under a version of the 1968 code. And, we call it the 1968 code, we call it the 1938 code, but in local jurisdictions, codes aren't static, they're dynamic. We had, post-Hurricane Sandy, something along the lines of 17 new local laws passed between, I would say, June of 2013 and December of 2013. All of them, some of them which went into effect immediately, some of them which had effective dates a little bit further out. But depending on which day you were obtaining a building permit, those new requirements could apply to you, and that happens on a regular basis, not just in our jurisdiction, but in others as well. And the earlier back you go with some of these codes, they don't address some of the concerns of modern construction. Their codes were very prescriptive of how to build a building, but not necessarily how to design the building. And that's a problem sometimes in designing repairs and presenting them as equally safe to a building official. And, just for instance, in New York City, we didn't have seismic requirements until 1995. The vast majority of our city was built prior to seismic requirements being in effect. So while seismic requirements in the model codes may be going down, that may be a completely new consideration for an existing building in the city. Also, how much work is going on in these buildings. It's not necessarily the safe, unsafe trigger of a building has suffered some form of damage, but what exactly are people doing with these structures? And I'm glad somebody mentioned adaptive reuse before, because we see a lot of that. Just to give you a comparison of the work permits that are issued. Over 148,000 work permits issued in 2012 by the New York City Department of Buildings. 1,462 were for new construction. All the rest were for work on existing buildings. Now, that includes more than just structural work, obviously, but people are doing work on these buildings on a regular basis. They're reusing them for new purposes or doing work on them either to maintain them or to upgrade them for some specific purpose. And so much so that we had to come up with yet another term. I know our committee loves our terms. We've debated greatly: existing building code, general building code. We developed a term in New York City specific to our earlier codes called prior code buildings, just to address the fact that put them into a bucket that we could start to deal with their specific issues of buildings designed under codes that just don't fit the current IBC requirements. So many of the repair and rehabilitation requirements are in guides, not necessarily mandatory standards, and they're not necessarily adopted. Current building codes, they address new construction. The model codes themselves, other than the IEBC, address new construction, and many of the mandatory standards are for new construction. And many of the ACI standards, for example, for repair and rehabilitation are guides. They're guidelines. So engineers on a regular basis ask the Department of Buildings if they can ignore specific provisions of a code that don't fit their needs, and those are the mandatory standards. Now imagine you give them an optional standard to follow. So these things are sometimes very loosely interpreted by people. As was mentioned before, the IBC is moving away from Chapter 34 and heading towards the IEBC. Now there's still some random requirements in the IBC for upgrading of your structure when doing specific work. Don't ask me how re-roofing managed to find its way into the new construction standards of Chapter 15, but there it is. And the few mandatory standards that are out there really aren't adopted in any of the building codes or the IEBC itself. But the IEBC is becoming the model building code for work on existing buildings. We debated greatly the use of a hyphen for an existing hyphen building code, but just stick with me. It's an existing building code. The IEBC is becoming the model code for that use, and you'll see here. This is a chart from the ICC website. It's been adopted either locally or statewide in many states in the U.S. I think it's something like 39 states. Now that doesn't mean all these other jurisdictions don't have requirements for work in existing buildings. They do. It's more of a local requirement. And just because you see the IEBC has been adopted, it doesn't mean that they didn't modify it on the local level. So the requirements still do vary, but at least there's a national standard out there that's trying to get everyone to one space so that we all know what we're doing when working in an existing building and what we need to do. Some of the brief highlights of some of the provisions in the IEBC and what you need to do. It does cover repair, which is a slightly different term than what's the ACI term. Repair to ICC means restore in the IEBC, means restoring to the prior condition, whereas repair in ACI terminology can mean upgrading the capacity. The repairs there are intended as in something just being restored to its current capacity. Anything above a repair is what they consider an alteration. They do address, the IEBC does address changes in occupancy as well as other things such as additions, moving of buildings, as well as separate provisions for historic structures where maybe upgrading to current standards isn't as feasible as with other types of buildings. Now, there's multiple methods of compliance. The prescriptive compliance method, which basically tells you which code to apply depending on what type of work you're doing, and it's very short. If you're doing new work, comply as new. If you're not touching it, leave it alone is a general way to sum it up. But depending on what you're doing, you may need to upgrade, or you may be allowed to leave things alone. The work area method, depending on what percentage of the floor area that you're touching in the building, will trigger specific requirements. And a performance method where you can demonstrate an equally as safe compliance with what's in the IEBC. And of course, just like 562, the IEBC refers you to ASE 41 or 31 for evaluation of existing buildings for seismic design revisions. Now, in general, these are just a general summary. I didn't want to bore you all with the rereading you the IEBC from front to back, but materials, new materials proposed for use in an existing building have to comply with new construction standards. Existing materials, if they were approved for use at the time that the building was built, they're allowed to remain in most cases. This is unless they're found to be hazardous of some sort. If you're thinking of asbestos-containing materials, that may be an issue. But in general, those are the requirements for materials. And for new structural members, they have to comply with the requirements for new construction and the standards for new construction. And existing members are permitted to remain, and as Gene pointed out quite greatly, that depending on what exactly is going on in the structure, they may be permitted to remain or be designed to what the original standards were, unless there are some specific triggers you hit. Now, you may have an increase in loading. The building may suffer some damage that triggers an upgrade. Now, everyone thinks of the substantial damage trigger, but there's also the substantial structural damage trigger, but there's also the substantial damage trigger from the FEMA requirements for flood-resistant design and construction that are also listed in the IEBC. And then, in general, there are some large building alterations that can be proposed without any damage to the structure that would cause or would require upgrading the building to new construction standards, such as a significant change of occupancy. One of the changes in occupancy, let's say, that raised the risk category per ASE 7 of the building, or a specific change in use that went to a more hazardous occupancy classification per the IBC, may trigger upgrading the entire structure, even though there may be no damage to the building itself. But again, the IBC is the model code, but it doesn't have any technical reference standards from the design standpoint. It'll tell you that you need to design a repair. It tells you that you need to upgrade your building, but it leaves it up to the design professional to come up with a proposal, and it leaves it up to the building official to judge whether or not you've met those requirements as far as designing the repair. Many repair materials are not addressed at all in new construction standards. They may be in other guides and other documents that you can reference, but you are it's up to the design professional and the building official to come to an agreement as to what the requirements are for those materials and whether or not they're suitable for use. I've listed a couple here where, 318 and other documents, you're not going to find these materials in Chapter 3, for example, of 318. The non-seismic evaluation of a structure is required in the IEBC, but it doesn't give you a reference standard like ASCE 41 for how to perform this evaluation of the structure, or the individual members of the structure to see how they're performing and how they size up. And there are no quality assurance requirements specific to repair and rehabilitation, even though they may be required. For instance, that I'm going to show you a little bit later would be FRP. The use of FRP in many jurisdictions is permitted based on the use of an ICC evaluation service report. Those ICC evaluation service reports all list required special inspections when using them. Not many people know that. I'm not sure how it is enforced across the country, whether it's uniformly enforced or not, but that's something that we find in New York City, that when people apply to us, that we seem to be the ones informing them that this inspection is required rather than it being common knowledge. Now, how does ACI 562.13 fit in? Well, where a jurisdiction has provisions for work on existing buildings, an existing building code of some sort, well, ACI 562 can be used as a reference standard for the evaluation and for the design of the repairs or rehabilitation of the structures to comply with the existing building code requirements, whatever they may be, whether it's upgrade the structure to new code requirements, to new occupancy requirements, or to restore it back to its original condition. The existing building code itself will give you the triggers for compliance, when you need to comply with new standards and when you're permitted to comply with the previous standards themselves. And of course, 562 has a nice little catch-all provision that says whenever there are conflicts between 562 and the existing building code, the law in your jurisdiction governs. Okay. Now again, this is, as Gene pointed out and went through, a very detailed assessment of what to do when your jurisdiction does not have any provisions for existing buildings, which is quite possible. We do have them in New York City. They do not. They're, again, similarly to the IEBC. We tell you when you need to comply is new, but we don't tell you how to retrofit a building. But when a jurisdiction doesn't have any provisions for how to comply, 562 Section 1.3, and this is the 2013 edition. Not, I kept my my talk to the requirements that have been finalized and are published. 562.13 Section 1.3 talks about how to determine compliance, how to perform an evaluation, and how to determine when to comply with new construction standards, when you're permitted to go back to the original building code requirements, and so on. And of course, Section 1.3.5 of 562 says new elements being installed in the building have to comply as new. So if you are installing completely new elements, they do have to comply as new. Okay. So some of the highlights of 562 that my colleagues on the 562 committee are going to be able to go into in much greater detail that I thought I'd just show you from a building official's perspective and how I see them. This is obviously a picture of some reinforced concrete repair work going on in New York City. Chapter 5, loads. This is a big hole, I feel, that this fills in some of the current code language that's out there, and that Chapter 5 addresses that you have to address loads during all phases of the construction and repair process, and also the shoring process. I don't know if IEBC at all mentions the fact that there will be temporary conditions during the repair that will have different loading conditions, and that those need to be considered. I know I may be preaching to the choir here with many of you as you've traveled here to participate in code development and things of that nature, but there are many engineers out there who sometimes when you ask them to evaluate the intermediate conditions, it's news to them. So this is a very good thing to point out to everyone. References to, that's ASCE 7, ASC 37 for unoccupied buildings and ASC 7 for occupied buildings as far as temporary loading conditions and loading requirements. So that's a very good reference that you're not going to find in the IEBC, and this really does supplement the IEBC or other existing building provisions quite well. You also need to consider loads that are not necessarily part of the permanent construction in the design of the repair itself. 5.15. So, for example, this is a very light rig, but at one point I think there may have been some proposals to cantilever off the existing balconies here in the existing reinforced concrete structure here. That needs to be taken into account while doing a design. Also, load combinations for external reinforcing systems are provided here as well. And the evaluation of the structure itself is also described here quite well, I think. Comprises two separate components: an actual assessment of the structure itself and an analysis of the structure, and it can be comprised of one or both of those methods. Again, this is a very performance-based document, so it is going to vary from site to site. Now, an evaluation will be required per 562 when the strength is called into question due to deterioration or some kind of additional loading, or maybe there's insufficient material available and insufficient information available to make a good determination as to what the strength of the structure is. And Section 614, where repairs are required on an element or structure, it shall be determined if similar elements throughout the structure require evaluation. So that's something that's not necessarily covered anywhere else, that 562 does a very good job of addressing a serious issue as far as a building official is concerned. Section 6.7 talks about the structural analysis for the repair design. And it has to consider the actual repair process, including the material removal phases of what's going on during the repair that's being proposed. And Section 6.8 does also refer to load testing as being an acceptable alternative. Okay. Chapter 7 discusses the repair materials. Again, similar to what's in the IEBC, and again, I'm generalizing in a lot of cases here, but existing compliant materials are permitted to remain. New materials have to comply. New materials compliant with ACI 318.11 are permitted, and alternative materials require approval, but it does address FRP and other external reinforcement, as well as giving performance under fire and elevated temperature requirements. These are very good additions to what's currently out there in the standard language as opposed to the guide language. Just a little bit on the alternative material process. This is what we have to go through now for all alternative materials, but if something's not in a code in New York City, you can propose to use it as an alternative material. The IBC, the IEBC, all of them, as well as many local jurisdictions, have the ability for materials not covered in a code to be approved for use. This is an example of how New York City does this approval. We do it through a buildings bulletin where we publish requirements we review them. We typically get input from stakeholders. We publish our requirements on our website in these memos called buildings bulletins. They are typically not manufacturer specific. Anyone who can meet these requirements can go ahead and use their product as of right, provided that they meet the requirements specified in the bulletin. And ACI 562 1.4.2 covers also the approval of alternative materials. Many materials that are proposed for repair are going to be alternative materials and will need approval from the local building official to go ahead and use them. And the ICC evaluation service does have requirements for FRP, post-installed anchors, and other types of materials that are available for building officials to use. They're not automatically accepted, but they are a more guidance material available out there. A little on construction. This is a part that most building officials do have some serious concerns about. One of the things that you worry about is the phone going off in the middle of the night and worrying that it's some kind of an incident or an accident at either a construction site or an occupied building. Many times, unfortunately, it is related to construction operations, either from an adjacent structure or from the work being done inside of a building itself. And 562 does go a long way in addressing some of the concerns associated with this. So contract documents, they need to identify when temporary shoring is necessary during the repair process and even during the evaluation process or post-evaluation if temporary shoring is needed. Now, shoring does have to be designed, but it doesn't necessarily have to be designed by the same professional who prepared the repair design documents. They need to be designed, but not necessarily by the same professional. That's been a concern that's been voiced, but that's something that 562 does permit another professional to do this design. Okay. A little on quality assurance. Again, section 10.1.1 of 562 says quality assurance is required when required by the local jurisdiction. Testing of the repair materials as specified by the licensed design professional and construction document observations are supposed to be specified on the construction documents. Now, depends on the jurisdiction whether or not you're going to actually have other requirements for quality assurance, special inspections, whatever you may call them. Again, I highlight again the evaluation service reports and sometimes the Department of Buildings bulletins. The local requirements may specify specific quality assurance requirements that need to be implemented. Now, the 2012 IEBC in Chapter 1 does say that special inspections shall be required in accordance with the IBC. Now, that's a good start, but Chapter 1 is probably the chapter that's most modified when a jurisdiction adopts it. I checked quickly. We definitely modify every Chapter 1 of the ICC documents in New York that we adopt. And I checked quickly, let's say, for example, Seattle. They've adopted the IEBC, and they have struck this section from Chapter 1. So what specific special inspection requirements will apply? Well, you got to check with the local jurisdiction. In addition, let's say you even do have this requirement. Well, it's going to send you to Chapter 17 for new construction with lots of references to 318. Now, depending on which version of IBC is adopted in your jurisdiction, that may have different requirements, and it may not include anything with regards to, let's say, post-installed anchors. It definitely doesn't include anything on FRP. It doesn't include anything about bond, surface prep, you name it. maybe some visual observation periodically of application techniques of the concrete material. So you're really going to have to work with the local building official to determine what the level of quality assurance is going to be that's going to be provided. Also, something I wanted to point out here that besides the quality assurance that's going to be required, if you have to comply with ACI 31811 and you're using post-installed anchors, that means you're going to need to have a certified installer for these anchors as well going forward. This is something that we're catching up to speed on in New York City with our adoption of ACI 31811 coming up this October. So we're going to need some certified installers very quickly to continue using post-installed anchors. And then lastly, I just wanted to leave you all with, this is the IEBC section 104.11 language for alternative materials and design and methods of construction, and what some of the basis is for how to use it. And I just wanted to point out that this is a perfectly good way to propose to use ACI 562 in a jurisdiction that has the IEBC as its mandatory language. And I'm pretty sure you'll find similar language in other local jurisdictions, and this is a good way to present the building official with a standard that really addresses a lot of concerns that they may have, and really puts a lot of the research they would have to do in evaluating a concrete repair or rehabilitation project up front for them, and assembles it in a pretty good manner. So I think this is a very good way to approach this. And with that, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it, and this is the Department of Buildings website should you have any questions.
Gus, you mentioned that New York City is going to have or does have an existing building code. Can you just expand on that? Because I wasn't sure that was the case.
Well, right now we have provisions for existing buildings that are how to address existing buildings in the administrative code, and it basically allows, depending on what you're doing, to go back to, let's say right now we're on our 2008 code. Depending on what you're doing, you can go back to the 1968 code. The 1968 code also had provisions for how to deal with existing buildings, and I think that was based on cost. So if you were doing work on a building that was less than 30% of the cost of the building, you can go back to the code that the building was originally designed under. So if you go back to some of my larger high-rise examples, if you think of work on the Empire State Building, you have to be doing a lot of work to exceed that 30% cost of the building to trigger that. I'm glad you brought that up, because right now it's not in a separate code, it's in a separate section, but we will be going forward with an adoption process for the IEBC, and I personally am going to be working on the structural portion, and I'm going to be proposing that 562.13 be included as part of that review process.
Well, Gus, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. It's good to hear the perspective of a user of the code. My question relates to Chapter 8, my favorite chapter. I noticed in your presentation you went from Chapter 7 to Chapter 9, and I was wondering what your opinion of Chapter 8 is and how it applies.
It's thank you. It's something that I had to cut out only because I was worried about time constraints. I had many more slides in this originally, and I've worked down to cutting it out. But I definitely think that durability is of extreme importance. One of the slides that I had cut out here was about, we have a local ordinance that we refer to as Local Law 11, where we require reinspection of every existing facade 6 stories or more in height because of the durability issues that we've had. And we're really concerned about debris falling on public and property. And if you look at pictures in New York City, you'll see sidewalk sheds up around every building, and durability is a serious concern. Almost every. We actually counted the number of miles of sidewalk shed at one point. We had a design competition to try and come up with a prettier looking sidewalk shed. But the reason all of those sidewalk sheds are up is because we have ordinances that say that you have to declare the building safe, or safe with a repair and maintenance program, and you can only declare it safe with a repair and maintenance program for so long before you actually have to do something about it or declare the building unsafe. So as far as the facade is concerned, and then perform some kind of a repair. So durability of repairs is a serious concern. Businesses constantly complain about how come there's a sidewalk shed up in front of my building, why, they have to provide them signage for their storefronts. It's an impediment as far as pedestrians. It's a very big concern. I just didn't have time to put as many slides in here as I could. But
You answered the question wonderfully. Thank you.
thanks.